Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I'm a tradesman, been in construction for 15 years now. Always stood out from the crowd with my colorful mohawk, electric blue, hot pink, whatever caught my mood that month. My wife loves it, says it shows I'm not afraid to be myself. 5 years ago we had our first child, a beautiful baby girl. Those 3 months with her were the happiest of our lives. But one morning she just didn't wake up. The doctors called it sudden infant death syndrome. No warning, no explanation, just gone. The grief counselor suggested finding ways to keep her memory alive. I started painting my nails pink. Her nursery was pink. It became my thing, my way of carrying a piece of her with me. We went on to have 3 wonderful boys, but that little girl will always be part of our family. Most people at work know better than to comment on my appearance. I'm damn good at my job, and that's what matters. But today this new guy on the site just had to open his mouth. He asked me with a smug little smirk if my little girl did my nails for me, like he'd just made the cleverest joke in the world. A few other workers nearby stopped what they were doing, probably expecting me to get embarrassed or defensive. I told him flatly that she couldn't because she died in her sleep when she was 3 months old. The silence that followed was deafening. His face went from smug to horrified in seconds. He started stammering out an apology, clearly shocked by my response. I just told him that maybe he should mind his own damn business next time. I went back to work, letting him stew in his embarrassment. But apparently he hadn't learned his lesson. During lunch break, he came over to where I was sitting alone. He tried to justify himself, saying he was just making conversation, and told me I didn't need to be so sensitive about it. That got my blood boiling. I stood up slowly, towering over him. I asked him if he really thought I was being sensitive, pointing out how he had mocked my appearance, made assumptions about my life, and now had the audacity to tell me I was being sensitive about my dead child. The entire break area went quiet. Even the usual loudmouths stopped their chatter. He tried to defend himself again, starting to say something about how real men don't wear nail polish. I cut him off, explaining what real men actually are. I told him that real men don't need to tear others down to feel better about themselves, that real men can handle seeing another man with painted nails without having their whole world view shattered, and that real men definitely don't tell parents how to grieve their children. Our supervisor had walked up during my speech. I hadn't noticed him, but he'd heard everything. He told the new guy to pack his tools, that he was done here. For a moment, my heart sank, thinking he was talking to me, but he was staring straight at the new guy. The supervisor explained that they don't tolerate harassment on his sites, any kind of harassment. He told him to get his final check from the office. When the guy tried to protest, the supervisor shut him down, explaining that this wasn't about nail polish. It was about him being warned to drop it and choosing to double down instead. He told him they had deadlines to meet and couldn't afford toxic behavior disrupting the site, and ordered him out immediately. As the guy skulked away, a few of the other workers came up to me. One of them, a burly guy I'd worked with for years, showed me his own fingernails, clear coat, perfectly maintained. He shared that his wife does his nails every Sunday, saying it stops him from biting them on the job. He admitted he never had the guts to do colors though, but said maybe he'd give it a try. That day something shifted on our work site. A few weeks later I noticed more guys with painted nails, some clear, some colored. Nobody made a big deal about it. It just became another normal thing, like wearing a favorite cap or having a lucky tool belt. And every time I look down at my pink nails while working, I smile, knowing my little girl's memory is changing minds and hearts, one construction site at a time. I recently lost my job as a software developer due to company-wide layoffs. It hit me pretty hard since I've been there for 6 years, but I decided to use some of my newfound free time to reconnect with old hobbies. Fishing was something my grandfather taught me when I was young, and I hadn't done it in years due to always being busy with work. There's this public pond about 20 minutes from my house. It's actually maintained by the city and stocked with fish regularly. I got my fishing license renewed and started going there 3 times a week. It became my therapy. Really. Just me, my thoughts, and the peaceful sound of nature. This day started like any other. I arrived at around 6 a.m., set up my spot, and had already caught 4 decent-sized bass. I was keeping them in my cooler since I planned to cook some for dinner. That's when I heard angry footsteps approaching behind me. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. When I simply replied that I was fishing, she exploded, claiming this was private property, that the pond belonged to her, and that I was stealing her fish. I turned around to see a woman in her 50s wearing expensive workout clothes and a face that looked like she just smelled something terrible. I tried explaining to her that this was a public pond maintained by the city, pointing out that there were signs everywhere stating this fact. She dismissed my explanation, insisting that those signs were old and that she had bought the property last month. She declared that everything there belonged to her now, including the fish I'd caught. Before I could react, she walked over to my cooler and grabbed it. Now, I'm not confrontational by nature, but I'd spent 4 hours catching those fish. I told her to put the cooler down, explaining that they were my fish and that I had a valid fishing license, reiterating that this was public property. She scoffed at the mention of a fishing license, saying she didn't care if the president himself had given me permission. This was her pond now. She started walking away with my cooler. I followed her, trying to reason with her. I warned her that I would call the police if she didn't return my property. She taunted me to go ahead, confidently stating that they would just confirm I was the one trespassing. So I did exactly that. I called the police and explained the situation. While waiting, I recorded her on my phone as she paced back and forth with my cooler, ranting about how the whole neighborhood had gone downhill and how she was going to have me arrested for theft. 15 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. They looked like they were trying not to laugh when I explained what was happening. The first officer tried to reason with her, explaining that this was city property and requesting that she return my cooler and fish. She refused, insisting she had the deed to the property and that the pond was hers. The second officer told her that she was wrong, explaining that the pond had been city property for over 50 years. He warned her that she would be charged with theft if she didn't return the cooler. That's when she completely lost it. She opened my cooler and started grabbing the fish one by one, screaming that if she couldn't have them, no one could. She actually started throwing the fish at the officers. One fish hit an officer right in the chest, leaving a big wet mark on his uniform. The other officer immediately moved to detain her, but she tried to run while still clutching my cooler. She didn't get far. She slipped on the wet grass and fell face first. The cooler went flying, spilling ice and fish everywhere. As they handcuffed her, she was screaming about how she was going to sue everyone. Me, the police, the city, even the fish, I think. The first officer asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked at my fish scattered on the ground in my dented cooler and confirmed that, yes, I did. They took her away, still screaming threats. One of the officers helped me collect my fish and what was left of my ice. Turns out she actually lived in a house near the pond, but nowhere near close enough to claim ownership. The officers told me she'd been causing problems in the area for months, calling the police on kids feeding ducks and trying to force joggers to pay a toll for using the public path around the pond. She ended up being charged with theft, assault on a police officer because of the fish throwing, and disorderly conduct. I had to appear in court where she was ordered to pay for my cooler and was banned from coming within 100 feet of the pond. She also had to do community service, cleaning up trash around various public parks in the city. Every time I go fishing now, I see her watching furiously from her window, well beyond the 100-foot limit. I make sure to wave at her with each fish I catch. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly petty, I even hold them up so she can see them better. The other regular visitors to the pond and I have become friends, and we often share this story with newcomers as a warning about the fish Karen who tried to claim the pond. I still haven't found a new job, but somehow these fishing trips feel even more satisfying now. There's something poetic about enjoying a public space while someone who tried to steal it has to watch from afar. Plus, I'm getting pretty good at catching bass. I've always been self-conscious about the scar on my upper left shoulder. It's quite noticeable. About 4 inches long, raised, and darker than my skin. 3 years ago, I discovered a tumor that needed to be removed. The surgery went well, but my body had different plans. It developed what the doctors call a keloid, making the scar much more prominent than it should have been. Usually, I wear clothes that cover it up, but yesterday was brutally hot, and I decided to wear a tank top while grocery shopping. I was in the frozen food section, picking out some ice cream because if you're going to suffer through the heat, you might as well have ice cream when I felt someone tapping on my shoulder. I turned around to find this woman, probably in her 50s, wearing expensive clothes and sporting that infamous "I want to speak to your manager" haircut. She was staring at my scar with this disgusted look on her face. She immediately asked me what happened to my shoulder, telling me that it looked horrible. I was taken aback. Who just walks up to a complete stranger and asks about their scars? I've had people stare before, but this was a new level of rudeness. I asked her to repeat herself, pretending I hadn't heard her clearly. She pointed at my shoulder, getting uncomfortably close to touching me, and rudely asked about what she called my ugly mark. I took a step back, my ice cream selection forgotten. I told her that it wasn't any of her business, but she wouldn't stop. She told me not to be so sensitive, claiming she was just concerned. She even had the nerve to suggest I should get it fixed, saying it was unsightly and mentioning there were lots of creams and treatments available these days. At this point, a few other shoppers were looking our way. I could feel my face getting hot, but not from embarrassment, from anger. This woman had the audacity to not only comment on my appearance, but also give unsolicited advice about my body. I told her plainly that I hadn't asked for her opinion or advice. That's when she had the nerve to tell me she was just trying to help, and that I shouldn't be showing something like that in public, because there were children around. She gestured toward a young boy who was with her, presumably her grandson, who looked mortified by his grandmother's behavior. That's when something in me snapped. I asked her if she really wanted to know how I got this scar. She nodded eagerly, probably expecting some boring medical story. I looked her straight in the eye and told her my husband had tried to kill me. Her eyes went wide as saucers. I continued, telling her about how he came at me with a knife one night, how I barely got away, and how the police never found him. I told her he could be anywhere. I leaned in closer and whispered that he could be in this very store right now. The color drained from her face. She grabbed her grandson's hand and started backing away, stammering about how horrible that was, and telling me I shouldn't joke about things like that. I played along, asking innocently who said I was joking. Then I pointed to a random empty aisle and mentioned that the man over there looked kind of like my ex-husband. She whipped her head around so fast I thought she'd get whiplash. When she looked back, I gave her my best unsettling smile. She called me crazy, told her grandson they were leaving, and practically ran away, dragging her poor grandson behind her, leaving her half-filled shopping cart right there in the middle of the frozen food section. A young employee who had witnessed the whole thing came over, trying to suppress his laughter. He told me it was amazing to watch and revealed that she had been harassing customers all morning and had already called for his manager twice. I replied that I hoped she'd think twice before commenting on people's appearances again. He said he doubted we'd be seeing her for a while, then asked if I was okay, noting that she had been way out of line. I assured him I was fine. I finally picked out my ice cream, cookie dough if you're wondering, and headed to check out. As I was leaving, I saw Karen in the parking lot looking around nervously as she hurried to her car. When she spotted me, she practically jumped into her vehicle and sped off. I almost felt bad for scaring her. Almost. But then I remembered how she had no problem making me feel uncomfortable about something I was already self-conscious about. My scar is part of my survival story. Not from an abusive husband, but from cancer. It's not pretty, but it's proof that I'm still here, living and breathing despite what life threw at me. And if anyone has a problem with that, well, I've got more stories I can tell. I met my ex-best friend in second grade. We were inseparable throughout school, college, and into adulthood. She was my maid of honor at my wedding, godmother to my children, and knew every secret I had. When I met my future husband at a local coffee shop where I worked part-time during grad school, she was the first person I called. She helped plan our first date, picked out my outfit, and later helped him choose my engagement ring. I thought I had it all: a successful career as a financial advisor, two beautiful children, a loving husband who worked as an architect, and a best friend who was more like a sister. But life has a way of showing you that nothing is ever as perfect as it seems. It started with small changes. My husband began working late more often, and my best friend seemed to always know his schedule better than I did. She would casually mention things about his work schedule, like telling me about his big project due next week, or that he was meeting clients that night. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. They were friends too, after all. Then came the day I borrowed my best friend's phone to call my babysitter when mine died. A message notification popped up from my husband saying he missed her already and couldn't wait to see her that night. The world stopped spinning for a moment. I confronted them both immediately. When I demanded to know how long this had been going on, my ex-best friend tried to explain, but I cut her off and repeated my question. My husband finally admitted it had been going on for 6 months and then dropped the bombshell that she was pregnant, while still claiming he loved me. That's how I found out my husband of 8 years and best friend of almost 30 years had been having an affair, and she was pregnant with his child. My children were only 2 and 4 at the time. The divorce was ugly. She lost the baby in her second trimester, and suddenly my husband was flooding my phone with messages. He would text about missing our family, claiming he only stayed with her because of the baby. He sent pictures of birthday gifts he never got to give me and kept insisting that the kids needed us together and that he loved me. He kept sending messages for months, saying horrible things about her, detailing her personal medical information, even telling me when she had a second miscarriage and learned she couldn't have children anymore. I saved every message, every desperate attempt to win me back, just in case I needed proof of harassment. Then they got married. I didn't send a gift, which apparently offended her deeply. She started showing up at school events, trying to play happy families. She would tell me how the kids would love her as their second mom, and when I told her to stay away from my children, she'd just get nastier. She would taunt me about how I was just bitter and how they were a family unit now, while I was just the extra person the kids had to see. But my children never called her mom. They never saw her as a parent figure, despite her best efforts. I never poisoned them against her. I didn't have to. Kids are smarter than people give them credit for. Recently, she showed up at my house while the kids were at school. She started demanding to know why I couldn't just be friendly and why I had to hate them so much, even claiming my husband had always wanted her anyway. When I questioned her about that, I pulled out my phone and showed her every message, every desperate plea he'd sent me after their affair was exposed. His complaints about her, his sharing of her private medical information, his repeated declarations of love for me. Her face went from smug to shocked, too devastated as she scrolled through message after message. She asked why I hadn't told her this before, her voice shaking. I coldly told her she wasn't entitled to anything from me after what she did. Then my former mother-in-law got involved, showing up at my door the next day. She had the nerve to accuse me of ruining their marriage and demanded to know why I couldn't just let them be happy. I shot back at her, pointing out how ironic it was that she was more concerned about their happiness than the fact that her son and my former best friend had betrayed me and broken up our family. I offered to show her the messages her son had sent me, including his begging to come back and his sharing of her precious daughter-in-law's private medical information. She left without another word. The next day I heard they'd separated. Apparently my ex-best friend couldn't handle knowing she'd been his second choice all along. Last I heard, she moved back in with her parents, and he's living in a small apartment across town. They both still try to contact me occasionally, but I've learned my lesson about keeping toxic people in my life. My kids and I are doing great. We moved to a bigger house last year. I got promoted at work and we have a new puppy that the kids adore. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.